that relate to romance, love, and there's an intentional irony embedded in that, because if you look at these works, I would hope someone would think that this doesn't have anything to do with love or romance. In fact, it's about an anti-love, an anti-nurturing, and for instance, here we have a series of containers, garbage cans, industrial waste refuse containers, the rigid structures that I have in these paintings. I would think that, at least when I think of love, it has nothing to do with the kind of rigidity that's imposed, but there certainly should be a flow and organic quality to it. So there's great irony in how these works are titled. These relate to the paintings in that I would work on the paintings, then take a break, and I would do a drawing, and then I would go back and work on a painting. So they're meant to be in conversation with the paintings, but at a slightly smaller scale. But technically, there's a sheet of paper, which has a very heavy tooth to it. And what I'm doing is taking a colored pencil, series of colored pencils, and laying down flat areas of color, but just dragging it across the tooth of that paper so it just catches it once in a while. Color, 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 about 3 or 4 colors get stacked so that you see through one into the other. And that's really kind of how I paint too. I mean, I paint like a printmaker. I don't think there's any particular one way to paint. I think it's bullshit when people say, this is a painting and that's not. I say, get the hell out of here. But I think that there's a whole history of painting that can bear that out. I have very little tolerance for conversations of what is and what isn't painting. But a lot of what I do with these paintings is, again, laying down flat areas of color that get stacked and respond to the toothiness of the gesso that's been laid on the surface to make that really difficult. And I think there's an irony in trying to make a really precise painting really rigid on top of a very imprecise surface. Some might call that masochistic, but what gave me the idea is when I painted my first mural, it's next to the high-grade deli. If you ever want to put your life into somebody else's hands, you can eat that. And but across from that, try the corned beef. And but if you the Reuben, but if you look at the side of the building across from it, that's a mural that I painted, and it had a very heavily textured surface with difficult bricks and mortar. And I thought that would be kind of nice to do that on a small scale in a painting and have that tension of because in that mural I did a lot of very rigid lines. And there would be people walking by in Michigan Avenue saying, what's wrong with you? You're trying to paint straight lines on that wall? Yeah. And that came from not knowing really how to paint a mural. So that comes out of that a little bit. And I think in some way, let's wander over here. If you look at the form of these pieces, I think that really starts to get at the content, in the sense that there is a rigidity, there is an explicit delineation of form, and for me, the more, how can I say this, the more controlled a thing is, the more degenerate it is, in some sense, which is quite the opposite of, for instance, I'm really interested in this period in German art between the wars. Between World War I and World War II, this group of artists known as the Neue Sachlichkeit, or the New Objectivity artists. And they were responding to Expressionism, and Expressionism was a kind of turning the inside out, and there was an outward expression of emotion. A lot of the New Objectivity artists had a rigidity that interests me. In terms of their content, they were also interested in kind of putting a finger to the air and just raising an antenna and knowing that something pretty awful was coming. And I think that's a fascinating combination of this sort of exacting image that has a certain degree of control, but underneath that is a psychosis. I always like to talk to my students about Stanley Kubrick. And when you really delve into Kubrick, you see that these films are rigidly structured, symmetrical compositions. There's an exacting perfection to it. If you take The Shining, for instance, beautiful compositions, controlled, steady cam. But if you consider what's going on in that hotel, it's the total opposite of control. So in some sense, I think that I'm more interested in exacting an amount of control because for me that there's an underlying lack of control and a psychosis that's married to that. So I would never take these at face value and say that it's only about this sense of control, that there's something else going on because there's so much control in them. Does that make sense? Yes. Okay, all right. And I like that conversation with Jeanette's work, and I think Adnan was getting at this, where this relationship between control and breakdown. I think there's something to that in terms of these works. In the vitrines, on the pedestal, are these 4 sculptures that I was making at the same time I was making the paintings and the drawings. And these are a little different. They still deal with control, I think, in terms of scale. He's not quite part of that period I was talking about between the wars. He sort of is, but there's a Viennese artist named Alfred Kuben, who painted, and mostly he was a printmaker, and he did these beautiful watercolor paintings, which contain lots of very small figures with large cataclysmic events swirling around. And they were really metaphors for contagion, plague, war, destruction, but the human is reduced, and there are these much larger forces. So I think that that's a way of, for me, thinking about these pieces, where they're very small figures embedded in these pieces, along with what one could call organs, but they're within this very overwhelming structure. And it's that reduction of the human to something very small that I think also relates to the paintings, where humans aren't seen, but I think there's certainly a suggestion of the presence. Cartoon bubble might do that, the empty cartoon bubble. This one has a light in it, but the batteries are going to be dead, so you're not really going to see anything. But if you were to see something, and you were to look down the shaft of the smokestack, you would see some viscera down at the bottom. The title of these sculptures, by the way, is Company, and that one doesn't necessarily need to know. I don't think the titles in this case give one insight into the pieces. But at the time I was making them, I was reading a very short novella by the Irish writer Samuel Beckett called Company from 1979. And it's one of his slimmest novels. It's very spare. The text repeats itself a lot. I think I repeat a lot of forms because that comes out of my interest in mass production, repetition that comes out of industrialization. But Beckett uses language in repeated couplets over and over and over, the same thing. Maybe it varies a little bit. It's a lot like minimalist music, where you start to find a little shift in there that has a lot of meaning amongst all of the repetition. But Company is about somebody lying in a vast space, having a conversation, possibly with himself, possibly with another entity. That's where the company comes from. Who is the company? What is the company? In the end, is it just yourself you're talking to? While that person is trying to figure out their existence. So, in my mind, I guess these little figures it's not known whether they're alive or not. You can't possibly define that in terms of the figures in these sculptures. But in my mind, they related somewhat to my reading of Company. Adnan.
A question. In the sculptures, the buildings with the patina, it looked to me severely aged, environmentally destroyed, and everything. But yet in these industrial looking architecture buildings, they seem pristine, clean. Is there a reason?
Probably not. I'll honestly answer this, if this came out of the materials. One of the things that I'm learning to do a bit more with my work is that I'm allowing the image to come out of the process of making it rather than imposing a meaning on it up front. I may have all these things I'm talking about reading the novel, thinking about control, but then sometimes the work will just take on its own life. So in terms of the surface patina that you see in this, I think a lot of that just came out of my pleasure of manipulating that material, but then I would be a fool to not stand back and look at it and say, oh, it looks like a derelict structure. So I'll allow that in. You know, I won't say, no, it doesn't have that, but it does arrive at that. And it's quite possible that despite my manipulation and love of the material, that maybe deep down inside I am slowly working it towards derelict structure. And then I wanted to get away from revealing all the stuff underneath and then made that one last where it's totally sealed, but it still looks a little. But in terms of these, I mean, they're kind of clean, but the color is dialed down. You know, when it comes to color, I actually love looking at really old comic strips printed on newsprint that have yellowed over time, and the color is dialed down, and there's an antique quality to it. So there's a kind of dirtiness in that. The color is not. These have been described as happy, but I would beg to differ. But in terms of the structures, I was just talking to Dennis had just given me a postcard of, and I love old postcards that show factories. And usually the way those factories are depicted are an aerial view, and they're very clean, because they're new. They were advertising something at the time that this is the new modern world, this is industrialization. There's very rarely people in it. It's devoid of humans, sometimes there's a little car. But I think the fact that these don't look derelict come out of that idea, that love of that kind of image. You know, the perfect image in the beginning of what these are. You know.
No, I do love these, especially by adding that infinite text.
Yeah.
That it could be anything.
The lack of.
Yes, the lack of words, but it could be satisfaction, dissatisfaction within the factory, the workers, are they planning strikes, are they doing anything, but also this to me, it kind of brought you and Jeanette, the juxtapose.
Oh, they're in between.
Yes, yes, and
Yeah.
I thought if you were working together, that, but I can see.
We had no idea. I mean, I sent a few tech phone images, like, look at what I'm working on. But we didn't really plan that. And these, you know, there's a couple ways to approach these paintings, and there could be a very literal way where one says, oh, they're factories, and those are workers talking. But I would really stress that that's not what a narrative that I'm devising when I work on these. I'm interested in the factory as a structure, but it can also be a metaphor for a lot of other things. It can take on some bodily forms. The smokestacks become something else. In this case, I removed the windows from a lot of the forms. I like the idea of windowless architecture. So they don't have to literally be about a factory or about workers. And often with these, I just like cartoon bubbles as an architectural element too. And if you look at if you ever read a comic strip, there's something weird that goes on with a comic strip. It could you could have a representational world where everything is in deep perspective, but bubbles are always flat. You're not seeing the side of the bubble. You're not seeing it somehow exists independently of the world that it's in, and that's something that I just like as a visual move, you know. So.
Right. Everything is so precise, despite the surface being like it is. And then you kind of frost it and let the, like frosting, the gesso runs off the edge.
Yeah,
Like
well, cake-like.
What was the reasoning for this?
I just liked it. It's true. It kind of goes back to what I said earlier, not to be dismissive, but that I wanted to have a rough surface, and these could be way rougher. I'd like to push this further, that a precise image is painted on. And that kind of doesn't make a lot of sense. You know, you could paint a rough image on a rough surface. Why would you make a rough surface to make a real precise image? That just makes more work for yourself. Because you can't, how the hell, your brush is coming along, and then it's like, there's a crater. What the hell? I can't, but I like that tension visually, and this one is a nice surface, but I would like it to be even rougher. But then when you lay down color, So if I lay down a color, I'm gonna get into some formal stuff here, but if you lay down a color, a light color, and then you put a dark color over it, but the dark color is just roughly, scumbling over that image, then you're gonna have some of that, the other stuff peeking through. So I'm setting the stage for that imperfection to happen. Or if I put a dark color under, the proper way of scumbling is a dark color with a light color underneath, and then that starts to peek through. So that's why it's rough also.
But
It
how
allows
do
me
you
to
get
do
that
certain
rough?
things.
It looks like Naugahyde or something. It's
What
uniform.
kind of chairs are you sitting on?
Well, this is rough enough.
There you go. Let's get some fine leather in here. None of this Naugahyde. Well, it's a roller, so I go to Home Depot and I get a heavy nap.
Okay. All right.
And then the gesso is really heavy gesso.
Right.
So, but then even after I roll it out, I kind of go back in and do a little bit of
Right,
that.
right. Okay.
I don't know how exciting that is, but
No,
this is
but
what
I
happens.
appreciate this.
Yeah, yeah.
I always benefit myself. Yeah.
The rough surface is kind of interesting.
Yeah.
So, but I want to make it a little rougher, and I wanted to do some other things I'd like to get into. This is the first one, so it wasn't as rough. It's a little
I
more
see.
dialed down, and then I
Right.
thought this needs to get rougher. So, yeah.
I love
Glenn.
it. Oh, go ahead.
There is a particular place in the Michigan called the Copper Country. I think you're familiar with, but it seems to me that the architecture in these buildings is to some extent inspired by that area. And you know what we call that area? We call it Company Town.
Yes. Yeah.
Never
The
mind.
company town interests me. Yeah, because we were sort of living in what was kind of a company town. Many companies.
So there's a
but-
tension
but-
between the precision of the paintings, the modernism of industry,
Yeah.
and the insidiousness
Oh, yeah.
of all of it.
Yeah.
In the particular, this hanging here,
This one.
are those trees in the background?
Yeah.
I can't see.
I mean, you're sitting far away.
I am, I'm old and blind.
But I'm not gonna take it off the wall. But we'll bring you there. I'll get you over there. But yeah, those are all trees.
So that is a common architectural theme in these company towns.
Yeah.
Of putting nature in this insidious order against
Yes.
industrial landscapes.
Yes.
And it's
Nature is
creepy.
ordered. Yeah.
It's a really creepy thing.
I'm working on some
I
paintings
love it.
now where it's even more ordered nature, planted, trees that are planted in a particular way.
Are these buildings to some extent inspired by the
No.
buildings?
I mean, I can't say no. I can say that there's a stew, that I have a sketchbook where there are 19th century French mills, 19th century English furnaces,
Well, these come out.
and I have to say also labor camps and concentration camps. It is the whole of 18th to 20th century industrial architecture that deal with manufacturing, death, everything. So there's a catalog of drawings that I've made. But then what happens is there's sampling and things are put together and something new might be made out of it. So it's not me drawing directly upon a specific structure. But there's a general expression that if you look at all of these structures, one of the things that I found remarkable is, and this is why I deal with even something like crematoriums and labor camps, is that architecture grew directly out of 19th century industrial architecture. And there are forms, and I'm looking at this book, it's like, this is the same exact form. And that had meaning to me, in many ways, the destruction of bodies, but the relationship of creation and destruction, the whole thing.
And probably going back to Romanesque architecture.
What's that?
Also going back to Romanesque architecture.
Yeah.
I mean, not Gothic, but Romanesque.
Yeah.
That block,
Brick.
that insidious.
Brick.
Yeah.
Yeah, and brick has a lot of meaning to me in terms of that repetition and that made in molds and just this sense of kind of enclosing oneself and building a wall and all of these things. Right now I'm kind of interested in, I'd like to take a trip and look at, there's actually a whole movement of architecture called brick expressionism that was happening during that same period of new objectivity I was talking about. And these are interesting buildings, but, so that means a lot to me, architecture, but not explicitly, starting to not deal with specific buildings, but pulling it all together. Yeah. Any other questions?
Yes, what are these small buildings actually made of? Metal, sheets of metal?
No, you mean in terms of what I made them of?
Yeah.
Cardboard
Cardboard.
from things I ordered, and paper gum shipping tape that makes the planks with charcoal rubbed over it. And then there's this wonderful substitute for paper mache that has clay dust mixed into it. And then lots of watercolors, so all the painted surface is watercolor layered on. Yeah. But the figures are little plastic figures rubbed on with black ink. And the organs are sculpted out of clay and then baked and painted.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Now that I've given you dinner for life. I tend to want to put a lot of stuff into the work, and then outside of that, I hope I'm not as dour as my work. But there's got to be a way to give form to concerns and fears, but not in an overt way. It's more of maybe a slightly poetic expression of being ill at ease with a lot of things. I think that happens. So, Tim, do you have a question? You look concerned.
Very pleasant.
I have a question, but
Okay.
I was, since you called me, I'm curious why you use an orthographic perspective instead of, say, a linear perspective.
Yeah.
And I think it has an effect on how we understand these things. I think it's pretty important.
Well, it's very artificial, and there's something idealized about it. There's no attempt for me to make an image that is that would appear to be from observation. And I think that, again, in terms of that aerial view, there's a sense of the macrocosm, and I think using that particular perspective, I don't want to give anybody the impression that they're entering into reality, but they're outside of this. There's an artifice that they stay outside of. I should add that I'm really interested in early American folk art landscape paintings. In particular, there's some, and even in early English painting, maybe around the 19th century, early 19th century, there are images of architecture of factories, of mills. And I've looked at a lot of those paintings, and they employ that aerial view because it comes out of a map-making sensibility of showing everything at once. And they employ, sometimes the perspective is just incorrect, but it employs that as well.
Yeah, I think that there's, I would say what was implied in what you were saying, there's something alienating also about that, because that's not how we really perceive the world.
No.
And so it also reminds me of kind of very early Renaissance work that before linear perspective got kind of, so you get Sienese,
instructions.
particularly Sienese painting, where there's that's a very similar kind of strangeness to how we're perceiving a space.
I think that alienation is extremely important. An alienated perspective. That's how I would describe it. Yeah. It's ordering the world, or reordering the world, and making a model rather than a representation. To me, it's the same thing with making these sculptures. It's a form of creating a model that you have a distance from and that you are looking over and seeing these patterns and looking into. It's a macrocosm, but it's also a microcosm at the same time with these little interactions. It's a good question, and I mean, I think it's a very important part of it. Yeah.
A little question. When you display, I realize it's kind of a little lower than average people's eye level.
Mm.
Then the way of you controlling the views.
Eye level's at 57 inches. That's the normal. That's the correct height for a gallery.
Oh.
Painting. Yeah.
Okay. And
Some
then-
people fake it and they go to 60. I stick with 57. Yeah.
And what about the, some of the in a glass cage, another one is without
Mhm.
any specifically?
Well, actually, I really wanted these to have a vitrine because to me it's like enclosed air. And I love the idea of having just one in here with this little ramp over here, so that emptiness plays an important part. This one is not in a vitrine simply because there was the option of somebody looking down in there, so that's just a problem-solving thing. But these, they could easily have been on pedestals, but I like the idea of an enclosed airspace that cuts off. Yeah.
Space.
Yes, yeah. And then there's a kind of airlessness, and I feel that the paintings also have an airlessness to them as well. So that's just extending that idea of an airlessness with the sculptures, finding space. Yeah. I would love to have lots of vitrines. I love vitrines for that very reason. It's that remove, that distance, that alienation we were talking about earlier.